Thank you. Well, that was a fantastic introduction. Thank you very much. I'm just trying to make the transition from Susan's wonderful talk. I think we should not try to literally see them together, but I think maybe in the conversation we can find some concepts that are actually, even when in style and in let's say subject matter, we might differ very much. There's certain concepts that I think that overlap, and I'm really looking forward to make that connection. So as Linda has said, this is one of we called it an interim report, like a sort of in-between report on research that is happening as we speak. We started working on this with Roel and Peggy only quite recently because we were confronted with something that was implemented in Unicode, as Linda said, the standard of standards that basically comes down to this. It's called the skin tone modifier, and it's a part of the ISO standard that regulates the way emojis are encoded. And it's this implementation of the skin tone modifier that we started that we used as a beginning for trying to think about what that means for when means for communication are in the hands of a standards body and how these standards are being organized. Because what you can see, as I will tell the story of how this happened, and again, it's an interim report, we're only getting to grips with what actually is happening. You can see that in these sort of specific connections between vendors, between users, between applications, certain sort of types of normativity are coming back to us that we thought we had dealt with a long time ago. So this is happening around the rise of the use of mobile phones, smartphones, all over the world, and vendors, different vendors, Google, Apple, etc., trying to sell these machines with applications that actually can do fun stuff. Emojis have, of course, a background in the faces we were typing with semicolon and making faces in our text messages, but we've come a long way. Right now we're looking at much more complicated images. And especially in contrast with what we just have been listening to, at first sight it might be something like a curiosity, a kind of thing that is being very pop, there's very much media attention, sort of lightweight media attention to, but it coincides with their popularity, the popularity of the emojis, coincides with raising awareness of how issues of identity politics are somehow coming through technology. So we thought it was important to look at it seriously. In post-Obama times, well, it's still Obama, but we're almost looking ahead. In times of Black Lives Matters, but also in times of Gamergate, that is still raising on, we see the return of reactionary ways to envision politics and people. So this is an image from when Facebook introduced the drop down where you could choose different genders, and so they staged this sort of celebration of diversity. Hiding behind an egalitarian discourse frequently expressed by those Fortune 500 companies that provide the very infrastructures for online expression, like Facebook, Twitter, Google, it seems that anti-racist politics and gender politics are being emptied out of their deeper sense and meanings for the sake of a commodified version of equality. So as technological systems increasingly represent, form, and interact with diverse physical bodies, we all go through these machines in some way. We speak with them, through them. It means that we need to radically rethink what it means to say everyone. In an era that is apparently post-racial and post-gender, we can see an actual backlash of racism and sexism in terms of discrimination on one side. So that's where Gamergate is really clear that how in this at the same time sort of diversified space, very harsh sexual discrimination can come back, and affirmation on the other side. If you see this image, and the developments around the emoji standards really reflect this tension. So when we speak about something like a standard that calls itself Unicode, we can really understand that in the world of computing, a world of computing that has always somehow quite uncritically understood itself as universal. It's a world based on numbers. It's a world based on execution, often not understanding in the material processes that are going on, and so much. But besides that, much of the work in computing, like if you look at what code is made for, or what people are coding on, is about permitting software to translate smoothly between different institutional, political and linguistic contexts. So the world of Unicode is very much at home in the world of software. The problem of universality in Unicode already begins by the idea that you can think that any problem, any language, any type of expression can be encoded into one single standard. So catering to the universe, how do you do this? So this is Roel and Peggy looking at the poster, which is downstairs, and it's a printout of 1/4 now of the full Unicode spectrum, and you can see this is kind of a massive effort. Unicode is a set of standards. It's the underlying infrastructure that impacts all use of text on computers. Not only on computers like the one I'm projecting from, but also on mobile devices, etc. It's super large, so it covers over 110,000 different characters. Only 1,000 of them, or even less, are to be considered as emojis. So in a way, we're talking about like a marginal subset of this super large standard. The Unicode standard was first conceived in the 1980s by 3 Americans, 3 engineers working at that time at Apple and Xerox. And they wanted to create a universal way to encode all character sets, starting from the English language to then extend to encoding all character sets that were used in the world. So what they did is they designed this sort of database of IDs that would assign a number for each unique character. So what's interesting to remember is that the Unicode standard is not about images, it's not about specific fonts, it's not about specific renderings. It's trying to make a reference number for each. So that's the code point for each character, let's say the idea A, that then by applications and devices gets rendered into a certain font. So this is to allow the people doing software or the people making fonts to make their own decisions on this. But the standard then regulates, for example, between different devices, that if I point to code point U0061, I can trust that on the other side of the world an A is being produced. If we look at emojis, we have another problem, or we can see the same thing happening actually, but it looks quite different. Here is different renderings of the same Unicode points on different platforms. So Apple renders the Unicode point for baby quite different than emoji 1 or Twitter, for example. So same Same issue, but produces very different problems. So as Unicode has been developing since the 80s, there's obviously many political problems in the way they have imagined this standard. For example, they started, so each character has a unique point, but it's based on this idea that, as like in the English language, there is a relatively uncomplicated language that has not a lot of combined characters. So for example, if you think about Arabic languages that often are contextual, where glyphs are combined, it means that people that write languages other than English have much more trouble actually typing based on Unicode. So there's already lots of, let's say, power structures embedded in the way Unicode as a standard is thought. But let's not get into that. What's also important, I think, to remember is that the Unicode standard is an open standard in the sense that the processes are interrogable, so all the documents around it are published. The standard is free, you can implement it without cost. You don't need to pay any license fees. But the decision making is done by these companies that are currently member of the Unicode Consortium. And they pay an annual fee of $18,000. Interestingly, of course, the price is only expressed in dollars, assuming that it's mainly American tech companies and some outsiders. There's some liaison members, like more, let's say, public partners, people, activist groups that are battling for specific languages, etc., etc. But these groups have no voting rights. So what's been interested in trying to understand what was going on with this, how it could happen that a skin tone modifier got implemented in Unicode, which is like a standard we have been working with for years, but only in the last years emojis have started to come into the standard. So Unicode has, from the early 80s, had images, but they were called dingbats. They're a bit scattered around. They come from different traditions of making images. The emojis themselves date back to the 1990s and were developed for Japanese mobile phones, and so they were used in messaging between people having the same carrier, Japanese phones. But in the meantime, this has spread much larger, and many people are using it. So the standard consortium that was actually developed in the context of document exchange, not even the web. So it's about sending documents from one to another and being able to read, like a Russian sends a document to a Polish, and then when you open it, you at least can trust that something can be read. This same consortium suddenly, with the partners they had, because if you see what the partners are, that are all investing into mobile devices, was pushed to implement these emojis that are quite alien to their let's say knowledge, their practices, their processes, to take these characters into their standard, and they did. Reluctantly, but they understood that to be able to be relevant in this market, they needed to make that happen. And what was interesting to see, especially if you're not, if you have been looking at Unicode from before emoji implementation, it was always like a super nerdy, hyper-technical world where only linguists and people speaking dead languages that were battling to have, I don't know, cuneiform implemented. I mean, this is the type of world we were looking at. Suddenly got a lot of press. Suddenly became like a favorite subject to talk about in blogs, in tech newspapers, etc. And somehow this seems to have played a role in what is following. What also started to happen, this is a graph that Roel made, it's the person with ball. It's the development of that character over the years. So again, you see how the character actually entered into the Unicode Unicode standard, and how slowly that character has become more and more anthropomorphized, more sort of rendered as a depiction of an actual human. And also, it's interesting to see that certain companies actually have more influence on the sort of norm, like how the images are rendered than others. But that's a detail. So over time, you see, with these phones getting more powerful, with people getting more used to, let's say, super saturated high-res images, also the way emojis are rendered started to change. It started to change into more and more, let's say, representational language, more and more detail, more and more naturalist representations. And so when Apple released their latest emoji set, something happened. So if you can sort of see the difference in their rendering, suddenly people realized that these yellow blobs were not yellow blobs, but they were actually white people. And a lot of discussion and protests started to happen when these sets started to circulate. People suddenly started to talk about these emojis in terms of not feeling represented, not feeling like them. They didn't look like me. I was talking on my phone and I couldn't, express myself as me. And people started to demand Apple, first of all, to change their emojis and to have more diversity. But as Apple is very deep into the Unicode Consortium, and also Unicode felt that in their promise to be universally applicable and for everyone, for always, they felt really a pressure that they needed to do something. At the same time, you saw that that in tech companies, the awareness of that something was wrong with representation started to really hit. And so in the period like 2014 to actually now, you see first a whole slew of reports being published and that goes from Facebook to Twitter to GitHub to all kinds of stories about how hiring policies were sexist, how there was no diverse representation of whatever, how things were wrong. And there was a kind of mea culpa of we have to fix this. And so in the same period that these protests started to happen against the all-white emojis, these companies started to hire diversity managers, people that were appointed to actually fix the problem. A kind of tokenism, but here you see at a big conference different diversity managers busy fixing the problem. So these demands did not go nowhere. They really came on the fertile ground of a sort of sense of guilt by these companies that they were not doing right. And so there's been a very fast lobby within the Unicode that is usually a super slow process to do something about the problem. So here's one of here's Mike Davis speaking about what actually happened, and I just read it to you because I think the language is very telling about how this is where this is going. So when we originally designed emoji, the goal was to be as neutral as possible. The emoji charts that Unicode supports are black and white, so you've seen they don't render colors. It's the devices that actually add the colors. So the whiteness was not Unicode's problem, it was Apple's problem, very clearly. The emoji charts that Unicode supports are black and white, and other people will interpret them in, sorry, question mark is wrong, in color for realism. we struggled with how to deal with diversity for a bit, because what we didn't want to do is multiply the emoji tremendously. So here you see the sort of tension between the standards body that wants to have a lean, efficient, and sort of logic system of characters that then has to implement suddenly like multiplicity and just can't handle it. So they had to find a solution. So what they did is implement skin tone modifiers. And so they reused, and this is something we can see over and over again, they reused two different processes that were already in place. So standard bodies are extremely innovative. They are really about, and I mean, they're called standard bodies not for nothing, about following existing practice. So the first thing they did is to think about what mechanisms they had in place to, at the one hand, make it possible to respond to this call for diversity, whatever that meant, and on the other hand, to use the mechanisms they had already in place. So what they did, they used the system that's also used to produce ligatures. I don't know if anyone knows what it is, but if you have like two letters that go together, that then form a new character. This is a special case in Unicode because, of course, it means that two Unicode points needs to kind of work together to form something else, which is not a new Unicode point, but is the combination of two Unicode points. So they use that same mechanism to make all humanoid emojis, or a certain subset of humanoid emojis, modifiable by like a diacritic in a way. It's like a little accent you put. This is the skin tone modifier, and the result is suggested to render then as a darker skinned face. So what was, of course, was obvious that Apple immediately implemented this mechanism. So let's say 3 days after the standard was out, they had it, and of course got a lot of good press for having, allowed diversity on their phones. Interestingly, on Android phones, this was until now not available. And I read you a so this is like the effect on different platforms. So again, you have, I don't know, I think top is Apple, and then how they render the different faces in the different colors. I'll speak about that actual standard a bit later. So in the comment, like asking why did you not implement the modifiers, Google responded, emoji faces are playful and are all about conveying the emotion you are feeling. They aren't designed to look human or reflect human characteristics, which is, if you imagine the blobs that Android does, they are really about a type of rendering that is as far as possible from these sort of more naturalist renderings that Apple was starting to do. But just recently, Android was announcing an update of their emoji characters, and this is what we see. So this is the former emojis, so this is the sort of abstract blobs, and they have decided to align with the standard that was being set by Apple and to start to render the emojis much more naturally. So they have let go of this idea of making abstract characters that are not about representation, and now go into the same type of language that seems to really converge at the moment. And so now we have the comment for this decision, which is, as we said to each other, our heads were spinning. So while cross-platform consistency was one reason for getting rid of the blob people, so there's been research in if people send an Android blob to an Apple phone that renders it very naturalistic, then there's this like misconstrual between the two messages. So there's been a lot of talk about this, so maybe that's what they responded to. That was one reason to get rid of the blob people. Another was to pave way for support of skin tone modifiers. it stands to reason that the blobs look great in yellow, but would look a bit weird if they had skin tones applied. So the modifiers actually started to standardize the images instead of actually this other type of imaging questioning what was going on with these modifiers. So in the next update of Android, you will have the possibility to apply the skin tone modifiers. So wait, I have to. So now, what are these? So these skin tone modifiers are, as you saw, 5 different scales that can be applied on a subset of humanoid emoji. And here is the reason why this specific Fitzpatrick scale was chosen. This is a quote from the documents from the Unicode standard. The Fitzpatrick scale was developed for use in dermatology. It is also used in cosmetology and fashion design, and it has the advantage of being recognized as an external standard without negative associations. So you can imagine the room of people at Unicode trying to fix this problem and having the tradition of never inventing new standards, but also always implementing existing standards into what they have. So they had to look for a way to solve a yet unexisting problem with a standard that would already exist. And so what they did, they took the Fitzpatrick scale that is about skin sensitivity, that is like trying to map how different types of skin respond differently to the sun. There's been lots of slippage into then mapping that to skin color, but let's say originally and scientifically there's no correlation whatsoever between sensitivity of skin and the skin color. But that's been completely taken out of the discussion. So here is what we've got. Left is the black and white Unicode representation, and then right, which is very interesting also to see, the different renderings by the different platforms. We see some color variations also in how these standards are being rendered. So apart from the sort of colonial reference that you're immediately getting when you see these images of introducing a skin color scale based on a faulty translation of sensitivity to color by a serious standards body, I think that's quite something. What was problematic also was that that they didn't actually consult with anyone other than some people that had made the comments. So they didn't really do proper research into what would be a possible response to this. They just kind of solved the problem with what they had. So apart from the colonial reference that is immediately present when you see this skin color scale, it means that the yellow emoji starts to function as a base, and this type of diversity become the variations on it. Because Apple had started by translating or transforming, or conflating actually, the yellow with white, people started to understand these modifications as a kind of blackface process, as a coloring of the white face. And so you're actually intensifying skin tone by making it darker, and so these colored emoji are completely wrong. What was even worse is that this gesture became quite an insult to people that are using languages that are not yet encoded into the Unicode standard. So like Bengali, for example, it's like only a small language, that are not even able to spell their own names. And there's comments around that they say, I can still not spell my own name in Unicode, but at least I can rant about it in my own color. So it seems that once the standard So once they had gone into this, there was nowhere way back. There was no way out, because once you, like already Unicode has many political problems and many questions you can ask, but it's a limited set within their expertise and also within, let's say, a certain modest ambition of the universal. Here they've kind of taken on representing the whole world. So even if in their design specs right now they suggest very meekly to not actually use natural skin colors, but to make emoji gray or blue, so that they would be more neutral, it doesn't really work when at the same time you have these mechanisms for skin tone modification in place. So currently, as to say how large the box of Pandora is, a new proposal is under discussion for a mechanism that would allow further customizations. Because you can imagine, if you start to discuss skin tone color, you also have to talk about age, about gender, about weight, about culture, etc. So the beginning of this is that they will use the same mechanism that they used for the same modifier mechanism to make gender variants. So now there will be a way to say this person with ball is male, female, or neutral. You can have a hair color variance. So a red-haired police woman is going to be possible, and directional variance. So you can flip the direction of the emoji. What is the problem, of course, is that these mechanisms only work on certain emojis. So there's a kind of limiting of what can be modified by what and how, which is carefully managed by the Unicode Consortium, or carefully, well, it's restricted by the Unicode standards body. It also begs the question, like, what is it we are actually changing? So this was one proposal that said, well, I mean, if you talk about hair color, maybe there's also hairstyle, for example, because that has very different implications from wherever you are. You can ask yourself, like, why is there no a female dancer, for example, that has a sari? Or why is there only one man with a turban and you cannot have a turban on everyone? Or what about different traditions of gesturing? Like, of course, certain gestures work differently in different places. So it's, you know, it's like you can't really solve this anymore. So we started to think of this as maybe it's just a question of resolution, that we need to address this by having more variations in between. But when we rendered this image, it was immediately clear that that is obviously not the solution. What you can immediately see in the slipstream of these mechanisms being implemented is many different let's say use cases that show how large the mess is starting to be. So of course we've seen already examples of people using colored emojis for racist comments. We can see that you can search based on what skin tone modifier is being applied. So that means that you can separate comments over color, like a color applied to the emoji. But then there's also the question of differences in rendering. So you don't know actually when you send skin Fitzpatrick scale 5 modified laughing emoji to another platform, how that actually will be rendered. So that's also an issue. Then there's the question of what can be actually expressed through these. So right now Skype is removing certain emojis from their set because they could be seen as offensive. So that's another sort of, at the one hand there's like a explosion of possibilities, and at the same time a restriction of what can be said with these. more seriously, Russia is now investigating if they can sue Apple for implementing the possibility to have same-sex parents rendered as a family because homosexuality is not legal, so then that becomes a problem also. And at the same time, you have a group that does fantastic sex-positive emojis to try and break the sort of puritanism in talking about sex on phones. And their emoji set gets refused by the, I don't know if it's the Apple Store or whatever, because sexual content is not permitted. So it's like a mountain of problems that, by the sort of naive approach by the Unicode standard, by saying these are just characters and we will treat them like any others, actually shows a lack of commitment to the needs that people actually have to communicate complicated content through these devices. So this is what we started to think of as multiplicity versus variation. And it's this, we're not going to have a solution, but I will end this story with this last part. So for us, the proposals that we see from the Unicode Consortium might be well meant, but they, in the end, are sort of technocentric patches, engineering solutions, really like thought from engineering in response to what is increasingly complex to do, not only cross-device but cross-cultural computing, that demands us to rethink compatibility, like in terms of difference and not in terms of sameness or normativity. Internally, the Unicode Consortium solved the problem by zoning off the emoji discussions to a special mailing list and a separate working group. So, because of course they were seeing that the disproportionate attention for the emoji discussion was overflowing the other interests of the members. But it's again a sign of how they're not taking serious what they actually have entered into. So at the times that we see anti-gay marriage rallies and national fronts of all kinds springing up with nice polished faces, we see, in reaction to radical Islamic bombings all over the world, heightened restrictions on civil liberties, or let's think about facial recognition, for example. It's really hard to not think about these movements with a slight paranoid. And in the meantime, by tightly keeping these modifiers to the kind of universalist belief systems of Unicode, they could at best come up with a set of variations, but nothing that had to do with dealing with difference. They aligned the possible with the available, and not at any moment made space for discussing or even questioning the colonial assumptions that were underlying the systems of encoding. So if we really coexist with software, which I think is part of the work of this group, then what generative forms of representations in and through software can we imagine? Ones that just not only represent diversity, but allow us to materialize multiplicity. What possibilities do we have to imagine a political, aesthetic and ethics that is really generative? So it starts with demanding more from software than variation. And it means that we have to somehow engage, and that's not an easy thing to do. Because it means that we have to not demand solutions from these providers, but we have to somehow get our hands into it and try to think also what we want and how we want these systems to be. And we need to claim a voice in the way these systems are actually being drawn up. So that's what we're going to start or try to do tomorrow, which is the goal of the workshop we will be hosting, is to formulate a comment into the formal process of Unicode that is currently up for, like they have these requests for comments where they publish the proposal and then the public can respond. And so we want to use this occasion to get together and to together formulate a comment into this process to at least signal, Houston, we've got a problem. Because we think that it's urgent to think other futures for computing, because we think we need other types of possible to become possible. Thank you very much. Yeah. It's somewhere there.
Let's just start with questions, and we have a microphone. We're recording this. We appreciate if you could ask it with the microphone. And maybe we can start with I think we're both trying to respect the fact that you, in one sense, it's very different kinds of talks at the same time, but it's, I think we can sense that there's a kind of questions of the computable, the universal versus the local, and so on. Maybe the speakers might have questions for each other already now, or we can, Linda and I have a few questions, or we can, we have a question here, and I'll just, There you go. Okay, I'm Oscar Hemer, I'm professor here at K3. Well, thank you for two fascinating presentations. I have a question for Susan, and I don't think, I'm not sure, it may apply to the Unicode discussion as well, and you might perhaps elaborate on that. But the question is about the incomputability of the TRC in South Africa and as well the Canadian. If I understood you correctly, that was one of the main characteristics of the TRC as opposed to the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia. And I'd like you to perhaps elaborate a little on what constitutes this incomputability and how does that relate to the critique of the TRC. I'm thinking of the fact that it was a process of amnesty, and where actually in some cases perpetrators to whom their cases had been built, judicial cases had been built thoroughly and for a long time, and then they could get off the hook by literally or metaphorically fleeing to the TRC and testify in exchange for amnesty. I don't know, but I was just thinking, how does this relate to the incomputability?
Maybe. Sorry? We can just use this. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think it's a terrific question, because it's one of the major controversies around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you rightly identify, in South Africa, that it had no legal mandate, and therefore perpetrators would actually obviously corroborate the horrific things that they did, but it was a certain form of amnesty was given. My research is really in relationship to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, I have to say, and that's the context with which I'm more familiar, although I did bring, obviously, images in. So historically, there has always been a struggle between the legal mechanisms of international criminal tribunals and then attempts to, in some way, the TRC emerges precisely outside as a consequence of a diagnostic in which the international criminal tribunals, they're able to do many things, but the one thing they really are poor at is justice. So they can met out punishment, sentencing, but the kind of but justice for communities is often not the outcome of a kind of trial, precisely, I would say within the context of the ICTY, which is the one I'm perhaps more familiar with. The nature of legal proceedings is such that certain kinds of conditions need to be met in order by the judiciary in order to produce a certain kind of, let's say, prosecutorial kind of objective to pursue that, which doesn't necessarily often fit very well. Doesn't map itself perfectly. Doesn't map itself onto, say, the kinds of demands a community might have. And one of the things that's was very difficult in the ICTY certainly is the protracted nature of the more than kind of 2 decades of the trial. The fact that so much of it was based on a kind of administrative archive, not so much kind of witness testimony, in fact, but actually, transcripts of military operations, et cetera, et cetera. So many of the people I've talked to, that's been sort of one of their sort of experiences has been this kind of frustration around that sort of process. And I think there's a lot of literature that will look at the law as an imperfect kind of tool for the pursuit of justice, but it can do many other things, and it is one of the few instruments that we have. I suppose this is really kind of early days, and it's in some way I would return the question to you, because I'm asking myself, what is the kind of value of trying to sort of think through the incomputable as a kind of analytic tool for understanding different institutional, say, we could call them mechanisms or forums that have some sort of quest for justice as part of their kind of imperative, and is it actually useful to to think alongside sort of computation philosophically and conceptually? Does that actually get us anywhere? I mean, this is the kind of question I also ask myself, because I can certainly see within legal proceedings with the very kind of extremely, I apologize, Femke, it's a bit of a long answer, but it might help clarify things for everybody in terms of what's at stake. I can see in how legal proceedings with their particularities around rules of evidence, their reliance on precedents, how easily that has availed itself of a kind of being translated into a kind of computational logics, as I was saying, in terms of one can actually parametricize kind of legal decision making. And that's been really interesting to me, precisely because of the nature of the way that law in the Anglo-American tradition, which is the only one that I'm sort of familiar with, although I did invoke, I realize, Deleuze's notion of the French system, French concept of jurisprudence. But we can see how easily that lends itself to a certain kind of computational kind set of operations. Within the TRC, within the Canadian context, there were so many events that took place that would never, ever have been permissible within any kind of legal kind of format. And I use the example of the kind of judge, because rules of evidence and procedure are so kind of determined and actually oftentimes extremely narrow. Canada, in fact, has one of the widest understandings of what constitutes kind of evidence. In Pakistan, an image does not actually enter into any kind of legal process. So it was really kind of this case study that I was doing, and in some way using a kind of analytics that I was starting to draw conceptually from the history and sort of and philosophical thought in relationship to computation, that I thought this was actually incredibly productive for understanding that the TRC wasn't just this kind of domain in which everything was kind of permissible, but there was another kind of set of operations happening there that weren't kind of reductive. They weren't about reducing complexity. They were actually generative and, in fact, productive of complexity, and that actually wasn't a kind of problem. And so maybe I sort of leave my sort of thoughts or leave my kind of comments there, but I think in terms of making the kind of argument and the observation, I think we, in some way, justice needs to be unhinged from punishment and legal kind of punishment in order for my argument to kind of still hold. I would have to say. And in looking at the Canadian TRC, it offers perhaps a more kind of sort of efficient example, because I do recognize the sort of the problematics that underscore the TRC in South Africa, and the critique that was arose in relationship to that particular kind of decision. You can answer the next question, I'm sure.
Is it working? Yeah, it is. Thank you both for your presentations, and I guess I'm going to follow up on that question, but with a question to Femke, actually. So because I think that kind of this incomputability of difference, I think, lends itself really interestingly to the issues that you were talking about, and the fact that the problem we might face tomorrow, or obviously others have been facing for some time too. And I'm not saying that in order to kind of stop us there, but I was just wondering. Obviously, you might have come across that issue in thinking about it, and I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about your thoughts on that.
I don't know. Yes. Oh, I just need to speak louder. Yes. No. That's of course there's absolutely a bridge in how do you. Well, if you accept that that technological systems, i.e., software, is part of what we are and what we do, then we do have to think much more seriously about what it means to exist with that. And then when it comes to questions of communication and representation, I think we have only begun to understand how to deal with that complexity. So I'm always, in some of the projects that have run up to this, it's always this sort of strange tension between high complexity on the technological side and super flatness on the conceptual or political side. And I'm really, I continue to be surprised how technological systems are often extremely naive when it comes to deal with bodies, with like communication, with and spend a lot of energy on the complexity of calculations, algorithms, etc. So I'm not saying that. And this is a question I would like to ask you, because for me it is really starting with understanding us as part and parcel of these technological systems. Then where can we begin to think practices that are less reductive and more more somehow taking part into that complexity. If you think about, for example, legal processes, do you see any place where this is actually happening?
I think this, in some ways, exactly the really kind of significant, I think, insight that Richard Sherwin makes, and that I'm sort of trying to shift, is precisely the fact that certain domains, and this is why I cited the conversation I had with the ICTY prosecutor in The Hague, who, for me, that was an astonishing statement, that as long as I get from A to B, doesn't matter how we go, a journey, doesn't matter whether it's a car or a kind of bicycle, it doesn't take into account a whole set of variables and that would occur along that kind of trajectory from A to B, because it was so objective driven in terms of the kind of the necessity. I mean, and I understand the point. There was a necessity that couldn't actually take into account a whole set of kind of differences, including within the context of courts. The technology is constantly sort of failing, and that's one of the things he was had a problem with in my reflections was like, because I was looking at the ways in which the technological interface that it operates in most contemporary kind of legal systems was relentlessly interfering with the kind of smooth operations of the kind of law through malfunctions in translation systems, microphones, projections, and that. But there's a way in which those kinds of ruptures, the ways in which all of the kind of technical infrastructures are seen as incidental to the project of kind of law. And my project is to kind of completely kind of in some way turn that around and look at, no, they're in fact producing the kind of legal condition, and they're very powerful in shaping the ways in which these systems kind of operate, including the ways they produce kind of subjectivities. And so, I would say that law in particular as a kind of discipline and a kind of practice has yet to fully account for the ways in which technological changes are fundamental to the ways in which they actually not just do the work. It's not just that they're using new kind of legal tools. No, it's changing the ways in which a legal set of operations can actually kind of unfold. And I mean, the fact that someone could even prosecute a case over 6 years that involved, maybe more than 1 million pages of kind of documentation requires a substantial capacity to work with databases, right, to produce your legal kind of argumentation. So I think that's in some way what I'm trying to do is kind of denaturalize the ways in which the technology is just seen as a kind of a useful tool in the practice of law, and to say, no, in fact, it's actually radically reconfiguring the ways in which a lawyer or a barrister could actually conceptualize their own kind of practice. And I guess this is what we're trying to do throughout the sort of workshops here, is what are the ways in which our practices are deeply kind of implicated through both the changes in technology, but the kind of ideologies that are inscribed in that that are seen somehow as you were saying, neutral. Oftentimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Couple of critical software things. My first thought was really to wonder whether you've got any comments on the implications of blockchain. It's such a trendy subject to talk about. Think about the historical importance of databases in relation to institutions that govern the law, the banking sector, I suppose, is the sector that's been talked about mostly in relation to this. And then to think about the implications of blockchain, and databases become more distributed, in what we've done as evidential structures, I suppose, in concrete. And then the algorithms take on even more power in relation to distributed databases. So that's one. And then my second comment is there's a kind of spectre here about the universal Turing machine. I think it's another way of connecting our two talks, perhaps, to think about not so much incomputability, but more computability at a deep level, where the decision problem, kind of famously demonstrates how indeterminacy, contingency, even uncertainty are embedded in computation.
For me, it's sort of early days looking at the domain of computational law, and the promise that, in particular, algorithmic law is holding out. So, the primary uses today are to facilitate the kind of access is facilitating access to information in kind of vast sort of databases. But tag now, but I think what's extremely kind of interesting is the ways in which governments, for example, regulatory agencies, so those are largely kind of government bodies and corporations, so corporate law would be another, the ways in which legal attribution is actually being generated completely kind of autonomously based on the sort of largely on kind of on tagging systems. So legal determinations are a consequence of aggregation of data across sectors, and we could see the ways in which that would become extreme. We can see very easily the ways in which that becomes hugely problematic. If we just simply look at the ways in which data analytics has been used in the kind of war on terror, in terms of the ways in which high-value targets are being kind of extracted, or through the mechanisms of credit scoring, for example, is another kind of classic where there's so many. Credit scoring is a very kind of useful example of the ways in which the capacity for sorting vast quantities of data across different kinds of databases. Sorry, this microphone is changing. Allows one to actually circumvent kind of certain legal strictures that are in place, particularly around race-based indicators in terms of determining kind of credit scores. That's one of the kind of most sort of well-known ones. So things that a financial officer might ask you in a bank, questions that would be prohibited by law, because a determination as to your creditworthiness could not be generated, could not be arrived at through questions that a financial officer could ask you, are arrived at algorithmically through data analytics. The cases I'm most familiar with are kind of American ones where neighborhoods, particular kinds of spellings of names within African American communities are often, I's will be changed to Y's and things like that are sort of used. So I realize I'm on a bit of a kind of a ramble, but we can understand how those kinds of determinations would actually acquire a kind of legal, would have, they would acquire a kind of legal sanction. And the problem would be that we actually don't know how certain kind of legal determinations are actually being arrived at, because we have no capacity to, in some way, reverse engineer that set of kind of data analytics. So, but I'm not, have I answered your question? Slightly. I mean, I actually think this is a really kind of, people need to sort of do this work, because I think it's literally, it's happening kind of like literally now. I mean, it's not in some way, it's research that needs to happen, that I can't actually sort of point to specific examples that I can sort of call upon, but I can look at certain kinds of precedents. And we might think that Creative Commons attribution, it's a kind of relatively like legally kind of benign, but when we're looking at things like kind of trade regulation, export laws, all of these things that are going to be being generated through potentially through data aggregation, then we're in a different kind of realm altogether. Femke, I should pass on to you.
Well, I have my own microphone by now. This is good. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not working so much or at all with blockchain. There's people that do that. What I think maybe, I mean, it's clear that these processes have immense impact on how institutions are functioning or not functioning. And one of the works we're busy with is how then, let's say, the technological becomes the outsourcing of the institutional processes and responsibilities. And I think that's something that is apart even from the legal consequences that has, to me, links then to this question of certainty and uncertainty, where the risk of taking a decision starts to be moved to data processes and technological processes and out of the hands of responsibles. And this is hard to see, because that means that somehow we're starting to do away with uncertainty and responsibility in a more, let's say, messy sense. Not like in the sense of trying things, accepting that they might go wrong, and so that is both on, like, I think with living so much with technological systems that we desperately want to believe in, that they are more powerful than we are, because there's a lot of that happening right now, while at the same time we see that they fail, that they are let's say that they have that there are certain processes that are very particular to their materiality, to their culture, etc., etc. And so I'm always a bit puzzled by, at the one hand, the urgency to accept limit. Like for me, the case of Google changing their emojis that were like wonderfully messy and strange to this more streamlined representation of humans is really clear case of where something that is not so clear, because they got complaints that people were not understanding these as clear communication, then becomes the drive to actually do something that is absolutely septic and promising clarity and directness, which is obviously not happening in these systems. So I don't know. I think there's many cases that the sort of the promises of tech industry align with what we want them to be for us. And I think that connection has to be broken. That's the first thing to do, is to accept that things might not work or might not be so reliable as you think they are. And then we can start to work, I think.
Oh, sorry, can I just say, ask you a question, Femke, because it's, I agree. What it becomes more difficult to argue when people are talking about automated decision making within robotic kind of warfare, because it's often humans that make the poor decisions because they're tired, they're angry, what do they do? Human beings tend to act to preserve themselves, right? They, as a rule, you act from a position of self-preservation, and that's one of the biggest sort of arguments that's been rolled out in terms of automated decision-making within robotic kind of warfare, that it's precisely in fact, this one writer, Bradley Stouser, calls the moral predators, suggesting that the most kind of ethical and moral decisions that one might arrive would actually be arrived at computationally. So I mean, I think it's a very kind of complex kind of area. I mean, I wouldn't wholeheartedly necessarily want to bring the human in and to valorize messiness as the domain of kind of responsibility, I guess.
I've just noticed that we've gone quite a bit over time, so we're going to have one question from Susan, and I'll use this as an excuse to say that we have these workshops tomorrow that are open for everyone, and you can just come with your questions straight. I think very much it's the intention to have an open forum for pushing these questions further, but we'll take Susan's question.
Working? Oh, yeah. I'd like to pick up on the construct of affective residue that comes out of the acts of critical borrowing. So initially, I'm asking a question of Susan, but I think that there's evidence of affective residue across what both of you were talking about. And my question is how you see it appearing, occurring, exchanging in the studies that you've done, with particular question on whether affective residue, as you see it, can be systemic. Is there an affective residue produced by algorithmic borrowing and convergence of systems, or does the affective residue come in once there is the human factor, like you were just describing, or once you as the researchers begin to borrow from different structures of knowledge in order to make your interpretations and your analyses?
Say that I was not locating messiness just with humans, just to make sure that you understood that.
No, I think, yeah, we're going to have some fantastic, I think, discussions and conversations tomorrow. What's been, I would say in some way my initial kind of thinking on this came out of the ways in which media produced under conditions of extreme conflict, strife, under what you'd say, very difficult conditions of war and state and political violence. They often produce very, I'd say, impoverished technical kind of artifacts. And so what was really striking was the degree to which the kind of what I would argue oftentimes is what one might see in the field of the image doesn't actually produce a convincing kind of representation in terms of, say, an event in which perhaps there's a massacre and someone has been able to grab a kind of camcorder and shoot some sort of footage on the kind of fly, and then the court, of course, has to look at all of the ways in which its defects are detrimental to the production of kind of truth. So my thinking kind of began there, looking at these kind of technical artifacts in which I would argue all of the kinds of the ways in which the technical attributes of some of this media, to me, revealed the affective dimensions. It revealed the context out of which they emerged. And so it allowed me to kind of look at production, the mode of production, and the ways in which sometimes we would see, in the case of the ICTY, like someone grabbed an old VHS tape that's been copied many, many times over, and these scan lines, etc. I would start to read what I would call, eventually, when it comes to the digital domain, a kind of micropolitics in processing, and it's those moments when there's a kind of translation between one file format and another. That is where I'd want to locate the kind of affective kind of residue as well. So it's not affect in terms of necessarily in terms of kind of emotion, but it's rather that's where the incomputable or some sort of surfeit or excessive information becomes quite kind of useful. And a good example, just to maybe ground what I'm trying to say, is the observations that Shoshana Feldman, a literary critic, made during the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, where one of the witnesses, Kasetnik, he's called to the stand, and he's so overcome that he faints, and so therefore he's unable to deliver the kind of promised testimony. And Shoshana Feldman asks the question whether the withdrawal of the kind of legal conventions of speech in terms of, say, recognizable patterns of cognition, whether it's precisely that kind of withdrawal from the conventions of intelligibility that actually produced the kind of true act of witnessing. And I think that's exactly the kind of argument I'd want to make, both in terms of the analog domain, but also in the digital becomes more, we have to start looking at kind of metadata, et cetera. And so that's where I've been looking at things like, for example, remote sensing technology that requires like 7 different forms of translation between different kinds of file formats, which are completely incommensurate, in fact, to arrive at something we might kind of call as an image. But I have to say, it's a little bit more tricky within the kind of digital context to produce those kinds of insights and to actually really follow, say, for example, a file along and to see where where there's a kind of friction, if you will, between different sort of file formats where certain information has to be either left out or recalculated, producing a kind of a different kind of value, but not a difference of degree, so to speak. Yeah.
Bring our questions tomorrow, and I just wanted to point out, I kind of rushed the intro. I was already time conscious when I was introducing Susan, but I just want to point out that this might seem very intimidating to a student of, for instance, computer science, or a student from gender studies who wants to take on board both sides of these equations. So in the kind of examples I presented today, but I just want to point out that Susan Chapelet is involved in the forensic architecture team, which is a fantastic example of people from different disciplines, from the law, from people who know how to use GIS satellite technology, imaging, people who come from backgrounds in post-colonial studies, collaborating together to form cases against maybe some act of violence that's being perpetrated, or to bring forward this kind of this research. And it's the same thing with the Constant Collective that Femke works with. It's the same kind of bringing people from very, from different backgrounds and producing really exciting work. So this is this kind of interdisciplinary challenge of that software throws even more forcefully in our face today, is being worked through by people like these groups. So, and we're going to go to dinner at a restaurant that's about 10 minutes away from here, a Vietnamese restaurant. Everybody's very welcome to join us. The exhibition, we have maybe 10 minutes to show you. It's going to be open tomorrow during lunch, and then all day Monday and Tuesday. And you're all very welcome to the workshops. Please come. Yeah.